If you want to understand why wealth feels so slow at first and then suddenly starts moving much faster, you have to stop thinking like a spender and start thinking like mathematics, because money has a personality at the beginning. It is lazy, it barely helps you, it sits there and looks small and unimpressive and almost insulting compared with the effort it took you to save it, but once it reaches a certain size, it changes character, then it starts helping, then it starts earning, then it starts pushing your net worth upward in a way that feels completely different from the early years. That is what people are really talking about when they say net worth explodes after your first $100,000. Now let me be clear, there is nothing magical about the number itself. The universe does not ring a bell at exactly $100,000 and suddenly make you rich. The reason that number matters is that it usually marks the point where your money stops being almost entirely dependent on your labor and starts becoming a meaningful worker beside you. That is the shift. Before that, you are doing almost all the lifting. After that, your capital begins to do more and more of it. And if you do not understand that, you will probably quit too early. So let me show you the psychology first. Most people have heard some version of the old compounding example. You are offered $1 million right now, or you are offered a penny that doubles every day for 30 days. The million sounds smarter at first because human beings are not naturally built to respect exponential growth. We are built to respect what feels large. Now, we are not instinctively good at understanding what grows slowly, then suddenly, then violently. That is why compounding surprises people. The penny looks foolish for a long time, then it looks interesting, then it looks absurd. That is the pattern. And your net worth behaves the same way. The early phase is dull. The middle phase is encouraging. The later phase is where people looking from the outside say, wow, that happened fast. No, it did not happen fast. It happened slowly for a long time and then visibly. That is an important distinction. This is exactly why the first $100,000 matters, not because it makes you wealthy, because it is usually the point at which the compounding finally becomes large enough for you to feel it. Before that point, almost everything comes from you. Your job, your discipline, your sacrifices, your savings rate, your refusal to waste money, your willingness to endure a phase of life that often feels unfairly slow. That is the brutal truth most people do not want to hear. The majority of your first $100,000 usually comes from work, not from investment gains. That is why it is so hard. People like to romanticize investing as if they are going to pick some magical stock or find the perfect ETF and suddenly their life changes. That is not how it works for most people. For most people, the first big wealth milestone is built through behavior. You earn, you keep, you save, you invest, you repeat, and because the pile is still small for a while, the growth feels almost disrespectful relative to the effort. That is why so many people never get there. They think the slowness means the strategy is not working. It usually means they have not stayed in the game long enough for the math to become visible. That is the whole tragedy. A person saves and invests for 2 or 3 years, looks at the account and says, this is nothing. Of course, it looks like nothing. You are still in the stage where labor dominates capital. You are still in the stage where your contributions matter much more than the return. You are still in the stage where patience is doing invisible work. That is not failure. That is the process. Now, once you reach the first $100,000, the emotional experience starts changing, not overnight, not magically, but measurably at that point. The annual return on your money becomes large enough to notice a 10% return on $10,000 is just $1,000 helpful. Yes, but not life. Changing a 10% return on $100,000 is $10,000. Now we are talking, that is real money. That is rent in some places. That is a used car. That is serious additional savings without additional labor. Now imagine what happens at $200,000 or $300,000 or $500,000. That is when people start saying, it feels easier now. Of course it feels easier because your money finally joined the workforce. And that is why rich people often seem to stay rich so easily. Once your capital is large enough, it produces more capital. That does not mean they are all geniuses. It means the machine is finally large enough to help itself. This is one of the most important lessons in personal finance. Wealth building feels unfair because it is unfair. The person with no capital must rely almost entirely on labor, restraint, and endurance. The person with capital gets help from the capital. That is why the first $100,000 feels like such a brutal climb and why every dollar you save during that phase matters so much. You are not just adding dollars, you are speeding up the date when your money begins to work hard enough to matter. So what should you do if your net worth is still below that number? First, accept reality. You are in the hard phase. Stop being surprised by that. Stop acting like something is wrong because it feels slow. It is supposed to feel slow. That is not a sign the strategy is broken. That is the nature of early compounding. Once you understand that, the frustration becomes easier to carry. Second, save aggressively. I know that sounds obvious, but obvious things get ignored most often. If most of your first $100,000 is going to come from money you personally earn and save, then your savings rate is not a side detail, it is the main engine. In this stage, every dollar you do not waste is doing double duty. It helps build the pile and it shortens the time until the pile becomes powerful enough to help itself. That is why people who say, I'll get serious later are usually making a very expensive mistake. Later means you are delaying the exact phase where the math gets interesting. The longer you drag out the first $100,000, the longer you delay the acceleration that comes after it. Third, do not make the beginner mistake of focusing only on cutting expenses. Yes. Spend less than you make. Yes. Control your lifestyle. Yes. Stop bleeding money on stupid things. All of that matters. But there is another side to the equation that too many people ignore: income. There are only so many expenses you can cut, especially now, when essentials already eat so much of an ordinary paycheck. Rent, groceries, insurance, transportation, utilities. There is a point where frugality stops being enough, and the next real lever is earning more. That is why I dislike one. Cited financial advice that acts as if all wealth begins with clipping coupons and skipping coffee number. For many people, the bigger unlock is growing income. Skill certifications, negotiation, changing jobs, taking on smarter work, building a side income, improving the value of your labor. That matters because a higher income does two things at once. It lets you save more and it gets you to the compounding threshold faster. That is what you should care about, not looking frugal, not feeling virtuous, getting to the point where your capital becomes useful. Fourth, start investing early, even if the amount feels embarrassingly small. This is another place where people sabotage themselves. They wait because the early returns look boring. That is precisely why they should begin. The boring part is unavoidable. You can start it now or you can delay it and still have to endure it later. Either way, the slow phase exists. The sooner you begin, the sooner you move through it. That is why I have so little patience for the attitude of I will invest when I have more. Number, you invest so that the more can eventually arrive, and you do it in simple, repeatable vehicles, retirement accounts, broad index funds, low-cost ETFs, the kind of instruments that do not require heroics, predictions, or constant emotional drama. I am not interested in making this more complicated than it needs to be. Compounding does not require sophistication nearly as much as it requires consistency. Now, let me tell you what I would do if I were trying to get to that first $100,000 as efficiently as possible. I would use a two-pronged approach. The first prong is obvious. I would systematically invest in the stock market. I would use retirement accounts when available if my employer offered a match. I would take it, that is, free money, and leaving it behind is an act of financial laziness. I would use tax-advantaged accounts where appropriate. I would keep the investments simple, broad index funds, broad ETFs, something I can contribute to consistently without needing to reinvent my philosophy every 2 weeks. And then I would automate it because anything that depends on motivation alone is too weak to trust over decades. The second prong is this. I would save toward ownership of a home if I had found a place where I genuinely wanted to settle for a meaningful stretch of time. Why? Because leverage plus inflation can work in your favor if used carefully. Let us say you save a down payment and buy a property with a reasonable mortgage. If the house is worth $400,000 and it rises 10%, that is a $40,000 increase in value. You did not have to put in $400,000 to benefit from that. That is the power of leverage. Used responsibly, it can accelerate net worth in a way ordinary savings alone often cannot. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not saying rush out and buy any house at any price under any condition. That would be foolish. I am saying that for the person who actually wants to settle in an area, who can afford the payment responsibly, who understands the full cost of ownership, and who is saving seriously. Anyway, housing can become a second engine, not because houses are magical, because leverage on a real asset can help move net worth faster than people expect. And while you are saving for that down payment, your cash should not be sitting dead if you can help it. A high-yield savings account or similar reputable cash vehicle can at least make the waiting period less wasteful. Now, let me say one more thing, because this matters a lot. The first $100,000 is hard enough without you doing stupid things to try to speed it up. Do not chase random speculation. Do not try to shortcut the process with leverage you do not understand. Do not act like every bull market genius on the internet discovered a secret you are too cowardly to use. Number, most people destroy their first real shot at compounding because they get impatient. They do not want the boring phase. They want the explosion immediately. So they force it. And when you force it, you usually blow yourself up before the machine ever gets large enough to help you. I would rather build wealth more slowly than lose years trying to look clever. That is why I trust the math. That is why I trust the process. And that is why I want you to understand this as deeply as possible. The reason net worth explodes after $100,000 is not because of luck. It is because by then, capital finally begins doing enough work that you can feel the difference. Before that, you are carrying the machine. After that, the machine begins carrying more of itself. That is the shift. And if you remember only one thing from everything I just said, let it be this. Your first $100,000 will probably be your hardest. That is normal. Do not let the difficulty fool you into thinking it is not worth it, because once you get there, wealth building starts feeling very different. Not easy, but different, faster, more cooperative, more visible. And once you feel that shift, you will finally understand why the people who get to that threshold stop talking about saving as punishment and start talking about money as a worker. That is the secret. You are trying to build enough capital so that it stops being passive and starts becoming productive beside you. And once that happens, your life changes, not because the number is glamorous, because the engine finally starts helping.